my thought process here, this is a fascinating hearing. We agree that the climate's changing, and I think all of our colleagues agree that the climate is changing, and all of our witnesses certainly have agreed to that as well. Now, what's causing that change, we can debate. Is it cyclical? Is it natural? Is it human? For the record, I do think humans have impacted climate change, and our behaviors impact and are accelerating climate change. Dr. Toll, you touched on the danger of groupthink. And I come out of academia. I'm a biological scientist before going to medical school and getting my MD. And there's a danger of groupthink. Groupthink, hundreds of years ago said the Earth was flat. So part of advancing science, part of academia, is challenging groupthink, is inviting all views in a non-judgmental way. The scientific method requires that we explore and engage in this debate. There's consensus as well. I'm from California. We're going through an incredibly bad drought year this year. We had very wet years as well in my region and floods. So we know we have to, when we talk about risk and mitigating risk, we have to assess risk. We have to look at how we can mitigate that risk, how we can do the things that are within our control to better manage that risk. And there's no model of predictability that's 100%. But we sit there and say, okay, well, it looks like it's going to be a dry year next year. Let's try to manage that risk and mitigate that risk. Maybe a wet year. But we do our best with the data that's available, and we invite that conversation. So I think this is incredibly important. We all agree the climate's changing. The objective data says the globe is getting warmer. We're having weather extremes. Dr. Botkin talked about impacts on agriculture, impacts on our fisheries. So let's just acknowledge these risks, and let's have an adult conversation about how we can mitigate and what we can do. Now my question, Dr. Oppenheimer, you touched on a real issue that does concern me. We already have quite a significant amount of CO2 trapped in our atmosphere. And we've had our Secretary of Energy in here, and you also commented on how long it will take to degrade that hundreds of years to degrade the CO2 that's already trapped in our atmosphere. From your perspective within the IPCC and within the scientific community, that to me, there's an urgency in advancing the science of how we might go about degrading these masses of carbon, and I'd pass that over to you.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm concerned about, and Mr. Kennedy asked me about this, is what does the world look like if you just let this keep going on and you get past 3 degrees? And the things I would worry about the most are food supply, particularly in poor, low-latitude countries, but also if you just let it go on indefinitely, global food supply. Secondly, extreme heat, as I mentioned before. Third, particularly in the context of all the other problems that humans are causing for species and ecosystems, the pressure of a rapid warming on species and ecosystems. Some are already very sensitive, like coral reefs in the Arctic systems are already under threat, and that involves just also the people that depend on them, not just the other species. And fourth, what's going to go on along the coast, where we know how vulnerable our coast is. So that's the picture of the world when you get 3 degrees and beyond that I'm worried about. And if you look at the scenarios for how you would avoid that world, you really have to get going now with some substantial reductions in emissions. Dr.
Botkin, would you want to?
Yes, Dr. Oppenheimer has just misstated some things. I do work on the Arctic, and I have friends, colleagues who work there, including Craig George, who lives up in Boulder, lives up at the very north end of Alaska. And anyway,
you wouldn't disagree that the Arctic is changing, though, would you? That ice is melting, that...
Well, we did a study in which we used the records from logbooks from whaling ships hunting the bowhead whales in the 19th century and compared it with late 20th century. And we found two things. We found that the end of winter sea ice extent was the same in the 19th century as by the end of the 20th century.
But it has changed over the last decades. It may have changed 200 years ago, but there's change occurring.
There's changes, but it has happened in the past. In fact, the Northwest Passage has opened before. We know that because there is DNA from bowhead whales and Atlantic relatives of them, which couldn't have happened. So these kind of changes have happened in the past. And as I point out, the evidence about polar bears is really negligible. Right. So there are changes. The question is whether these changes are really damaging or not, and the evidence is not strong that it's damaging.
I've gone over my time, so again, thank you to my colleague from Texas.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Bera.